Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. In this episode, we explore the father of history, Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Herodotus of Halicarnassus is the most famous historian of antiquity. He is also the patron saint, if you will, of journalist historians, that rare breed of men and women of the pen who relate exciting tales from afar in a prose digestible and energetic to read. Is there, however, a theme that unites the seemingly disparate and elongated work of the Histories? What drives Herodotus's histories onward? Herodotus certainly did not have a conception of history, sort of with a capital H, as we moderns tend to have, the so-called Whig interpretation of history, or the view that history is moving towards an end goal. But Herodotus's histories does have a major theme underlying its composition: the contest between justice and injustice, or properly, in the Greek, between tisis and hubris, and how this governs human action. It is false to suggest that Herodotus is the historian of social justice, but it is true to say that Herodotus gives a lot of consideration to the problem of justice and how the desire for justice governs human action. As Donald Latner wrote long ago, in the middle of the 20th century, Herodotus's extension of tisis from a merely ethical principle to an encompassing law of nature is now widely recognized. And when you read academic and scholarly interpretations of Herodotus, his wrestling with justice and how it impacts human action is one of the most frequent themes discussed in academic literature. At face value, the Histories is the account of the war between the Greeks and the Persians, which ended in the defeat of the supposedly monstrous and barbarous Persian Empire at the hands of a collection of rough Greek city-states who even had conspirators in their midst, a sad fact that the city-states that allied with the Persians would never be allowed to forget, like Thebes. Yet a deeper reading of the Histories shows an intensely philosophical and inquisitive man than what is sometimes lost in the long digressions on ethnography and cultural practices of the diverse peoples that he covers. Herodotus was and remains a deep thinker of the highest caliber, despite popular, if not otherwise ignorant, ridicule of him as a myth-maker and a liar. History, as we know, comes from the Greek word historia. The problem with history for moderns is that we have inherited two rather recent conceptions of history born of the so-called Enlightenment mode of thinking. And anybody familiar with Isaiah Berlin will know that we moderns, although in some ways are inheritors of the ancient culture and tradition of the Greeks and Romans, we are at the same time deeply and fundamentally removed from their cultural milieu. Many will no doubt be familiar with the notion of scientific history, best encapsulated by Leopold von Ranke's conception of history as it was, a sort of recapitulation of history as a mechanical cause and effect process. The other conception of history, which we are also inheritors of, is born out of modern philosophy. Hegel is probably the most notable figure in the crafting of historicism, but the progressive or Whig view of history is what most moderns will immediately recognize: the belief that history progresses from darkness and primitivism to light and civility, over a period of organic successions. Both conceptions of history, as we moderns tend to have, were alien to the Greeks, and therefore unknown to Herodotus. Reading Herodotus, or even Thucydides for that matter, as a scientific historian, misses the point. It also does tremendous harm in understanding the point of the work. Historia in Greek means inquiry. What then is Herodotus inquiring into? As his famous opening begins, Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry, his history, so that human achievements may not be forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the two peoples fought with each other. In his opening, Herodotus evokes Homer and states the reality of his work being an inquiry into human action. Herodotus doesn't invoke the Muses, as Homer does, but like Homer, human beings are the subject of his inquiry. Herodotus is more the heir of Homer than it initially seems. And on this note, while a lot of academic literature concentrates on the question and issue of justice in Herodotus, a lot of academic literature also concerns itself with Herodotus's inspiration from Homer. Homer, moderns crudely believe, wrote a poetic fairy tale, or at least some people still believe that. It was common through much of the 19th century to believe the Trojan War to be a poetic invention, until the discovery of a burnt-out city on the coast of Turkey gave greater credence to the story of the Trojan War, and eventually led to the conclusion that some type of war between Troy and the Greeks actually happened. We must remember, however, that Homer, though a poet, sung of a man, Achilles. Homer begins the humanistic turning in Western consciousness, as we've discussed in our episode on Homer's Iliad. Hesiod's Theogony sung the praises of bloodthirsty and capricious gods. Homer's poems, while still retaining the gods as central figures, focuses on men. Moreover, Homer's epics are adventures marked by war and conflict. The astute reader of Herodotus will immediately recognize now that he is indeed the heir of Homer. Herodotus, after all, is chiefly concerned with human achievements, so that they will not be forgotten in time, and writes a work that is an adventure narrative across many landscapes and cities, dominated by the maelstrom of war and conflict. Herodotus's own prose and style, for those who can read Greek, mirrors that of Homer. The first book of the Histories paints for us a picture of a bleak world not far removed from the dark agonistic cosmos of Hesiod, or for that matter, Homer. Herodotus's inquiry begins by telling stories of abduction and rape, acts of injustice which get the ball rolling. These women were standing about near the vessel's stern, buying what they fancied, when suddenly the Phoenician sailors passed the word along and made a rush at them. The greater number got away, but Io and some others were caught and bundled aboard the ship, which cleared at once and made off for Egypt. As Herodotus goes on to tell, this, according to the Persian account, is how Io came to Egypt, and this was the first in a series of unjust acts. The Greeks subsequently land in Tyre, and repay the Phoenicians back for their unjust act by abducting Europa and bringing her back to Hellas, thus bestowing the continental name to Europe. In the opening moments of the Histories, Herodotus informs us that injustice is what propels the narrative forward, and how unjust acts lead to a desire for justice. Aristotle may have provided the most familiar account of justice in the Greek world, paying each his due, but the Greek understanding of justice was essentially punitive and retributive. Tisis is the Greek word for justice which Herodotus uses in his work, and it is entirely retributive in its Greek context and understanding. As Hipparchus later learns from the oracle, no man does wrong, and shall not the penalty bear. There would be no great movement of human action without the motivating impulse of justice to punish a preceding act of injustice. At the start, then, Herodotus lets us know there is something deep about his inquiry. It is an inquiry into human action and how justice is at the core of the human condition, which is shared by the Greeks and the barbarians, the Persians, alike. The first book seems far removed from the Persian Wars, which occurred in the 5th century BC, but with the understanding that Herodotus is investigating human action, and principally the role of justice as a governing force for human action, we can begin to understand the remoteness and obscurity of the many stories before we finally arrive at the climax of human action up to Herodotus' time, the battle for justice that was the Persian Wars. After discussing the abduction and rape of Io and Europa, Herodotus tells us the story of the abduction of Helen by Paris of Troy and the Trojan War, which followed and ended with the sack and burning of Troy. Such, then, is the Persian story. In their view, it was the capture of Troy that made them enemies of the Greeks. Herodotus, though a Greek partisan, does give consideration to the Persian story and explains why the Persians felt themselves in the right in seeking to conquer Greece. The Greeks had first conquered a brother of the East. From there, Herodotus proceeds to tell us what many might regard as mythic stories of courtly rape and usurpation. Again, to get lost in the supposed fictionality of these stories, for that is what the word myth means in Greek, story or proclamation, is to again miss the point of Herodotus' inquiry. These stories, brutal and sometimes banal as they are, all underscore the reality of revenge, power, justice, and injustice which govern human action and advances the inquiry, the history, further. We also witness an investigation of human psychology over committing unjust acts, like when Gyges usurped the throne and then sought out the Delphi oracle to have a story legitimize his seizure of power. Knowing one has committed injustice leads to a pervasive psychological guilt, a guilt which St. Augustine would further develop in his Psychology of Sin and Original Guilt. But that guilt can be assuaged by divine sanction, so long as divine sanction supports your crime. In relaying the long story of Krause, who is important because he came into conflict with King Cyrus of Persia in the prelude to the Persian Wars after hearing the news of the death of his son in a hunting accident, Herodotus writes, Croesus prayed to Zeus to witness what he had suffered at the hands of his guest. He invoked Zeus again under his title of protector of the hearth, because he had unwittingly entertained his son's murder in his own house, and yet again as god of guest friendship, because the man he had sent to guard his son had turned out to be his bitterest enemy. In the story, we witness the long march and desire, nay demand for justice, which becomes the retributive fuel that advances human action to seek closure. The great and marvelous deeds of men that Herodotus wants to eulogize are actions seeking justice against injustice. Caught up in this turbulent struggle is how pride cometh before the fall. For Herodotus, power is the product of injustices piled upon injustices, as should be clear after reading the first book. Power is constantly usurped by acts of betrayal, treachery, and murder. The attainment of power subsequently inflates the ego in a conceit of self-importance. This accruement of power is what is called hubris, or immense pride, which is necessarily called by an act of destruction, which the Greeks called nemesis or nemesis. The Persians may have felt themselves justified in their war against the Greeks by reaching back to the past and invoking the destruction of Troy as their casus belli for war, but Herodotus's pro-Greek sentiments begin to show. The Persians, he writes, whom Darius had left under Magabazus, Magabazus's command, began hostilities against the Greeks on the Hellespont by subduing the Perinthians, who refused to accept Persian domination. Herodotus, in resuming the narrative of the Persian War, at long last, informs us that the Perinthians refused to be subjugated to Persian imperialism. Importantly, the Persians are also in Europe, having transgressed the natural boundary of Europe and Asia, which is the Hellespont. Persia is no longer the small but consolidated kingdom it was prior to the sacking of Babylon. It has grown into an oversized empire filled with hubris over its glorious conquests and accomplishments. Everywhere the Persians go, Herodotus tells us, they commit injustice. Forced relocation, slavery, and subjugation are just a few of the injustices they commit as their power expands by these acts of injustice. When enslaving the men and women of Lemnos, Herodotus explains the reason Otantes gave for subjugating and enslaving all these people was that some had shirked service in the Scythian expedition, while others had molested Darius's army on its way home. While Herodotus does portray the Persians as despotic and unjust, he is remarkably even-handed, all things considered, when you look closely at the narrative. Just as he had, all the way back in the first book, informed us that the Persians invoke the destruction of Troy for their call for justice against Greek invasion and colonization. Even here, in more nakedly brutal episodes, the Persian story is interwoven into the narrative. The Persians felt injustice done unto them at earlier times. This was merely the manifestation of justice, repaying a prior act of injustice. So while we know that Herodotus felt the Greeks were in the right to seek justice against Persian aggression, whenever we look carefully at the narrative, he does in fact give the Persian side of the story. Herodotus, as we begin to see, is a theorist of human action, and ultimately a theorist of justice. Justice, according to Herodotus, is the chief force of human action. Justice, his inquiry is clearly telling us, is what governs all human action, all human desire. Fathers, sons, warriors, kings, queens, priests and priestesses all cry out to their gods for justice, retributive justice, we might remember, to be done. Again, Herodotus is not far removed from Homer in this regard, for Homer repeatedly has his characters cry out to Zeus and other gods for justice after having been spited by an act of injustice. It is now clear why Herodotus juxtaposes the Persian story with the Greek account in this dialectical tale of contrasts. He wishes us to think alongside him about the nature of justice. Is the Persian account of justice truly just? We obviously know what Herodotus thought, but he never denies the Persian side of the story, even if we are meant to view the Persian story as manifestly unjust. What brings the Greeks and Persians into full-blown war are acts of injustice, demanding acts of retributive justice in return. Aristogoras of Miletus sails to Hellas to try and convene an alliance of Greek city-states to help their beleaguered brethren in Asia Minor. Rebuffed initially by Sparta, Aristogoras makes progress in Athens. Herodotus again gives extensive digressive backstory, but still filled the themes of power, usurpation, justice, and injustice. When you read these backstories, you see the themes of power, usurpation, and especially justice and injustice in these digressive stories. Aristogoras convinces the Athenians to aid them in their struggle against Persian expansionism. Greek custom and history now comes into conflict with Persian expansionist power. Aristogoras has been thus far an ambassador seeking justice and liberty on behalf of those suffering injustice and oppression. This makes Aristogoras' fate even more tragic, since he becomes the very thing he fretted, a despotic conqueror. Now in Athens, however, this entry of Aristogoras leads us further into the abyss of violence and revenge, the themes of liberty and justice against despotism and injustice. While it is seductive to see the tale of liberty and despotism pervading the histories, it should be clear upon closer inspection, irrespective of whether you have any knowledge of Greek, that this theme had been catapulted to the front of our readings of Herodotus by the Whigs, and that is in fact secondary to the larger theme of justice and injustice that guides the entire work. Liberty, to be sure, manifests itself on the side of justice, which is important for us moderns because we tend to think the same way, that true liberty is synonymous with true justice, and despotism manifests itself on the side of injustice, but the liberty-despotism dialectic is itself a product of modern conceptions of history, otherwise alien to Herodotus and his contemporaries. Take, for example, the great poet-playwright Aeschylus. Aeschylus had served with the Athenians at Marathon, and likely served at the Battle of Salamis. Undoubtedly Athenian in orientation, even his play The Persians doesn't put liberty versus tyranny as the central concern of the play. Instead, it is the elusive question of justice which pervades the play, as it also is in the Oresteia. Liberty, life, and love, when it does manifest itself in the Greek literary corpus, is always subordinate to the quest for justice. The Greeks lose liberty, life, and love whenever injustice rears its ugly head. Liberty, as is clear in Herodotus, Aeschylus, and the rest of the Greek literary corpus, is a product of justice, which means justice is the primary font on which everything else flows. Returning to the Athenian intervention, the Athenians burn the Cybele temple of Sardis down, a city and temple now under the control of the Persians. In the conflagration at Sardis, a temple of Cybele, a goddess worshipped by the natives, Herodotus writes, was destroyed, and the Persians later made this a pretext for their burning of Greek temples. Again, even here, the Persian side of the story is recounted. We witness an act of injustice, from the Persian perspective, which motivates them to take revenge, retributive justice, against the Athenians. The story goes, Herodotus relates to us when considering the emotional outburst of Darius, that when Darius learned of the disaster, he did not give a thought to the Ionians, knowing perfectly well that the punishment for their revolt would come. But he asked who the Athenians were, and then, on being told, called for his bow. He took it, sent an arrow on the string, sent it up into the air, and cried, "Grant, O God, that I may punish the Athenians." Herodotus helps to give thematic consideration to the Persian War by the end of the 5th book. Human nature, it is now clear, if it shouldn't have been earlier, is moved by desire for retributive justice. But what is the basis for the breach of justice? How do we know what is just and what is unjust? The lack of honoring custom and natural boundaries, that is what is unjust, and when those realities are transgressed, the desire for justice is eminently fair. The Persians, as they expand, breach all the customary laws and traditions of the people they conquer. In conquering them, they also expand beyond normal boundaries. This feeds them with hubris, powerful pride, which demands destruction at the hands of those seeking justice. Justice and injustice, now, is the unmistakable spirit guiding Herodotus' inquiry. In the 6th book, we witness Persian injustice and despotism wherever they advance. Pillage, destruction, and enslavement occur on a massive scale. This is the prospect waiting the free city-states of Greece, who, as Herodotus informed us through those long digressive backstories, which is now important to realize, had just thrown off the old tyrannies and their injustice to enjoy the relative justice and liberty they now have. The long digressions thus serve to emphasize the just defense of Greek liberty. Even here, however, we again see how liberty is still subordinate to justice. Individual and collective acts of injustice are met by tisis, which brings the mises to the guilty party. Individually, we see this with Cleomenes and Miltiades. Collectively, we witness this with the Persians at the ferocious battles of Marathon and Salamis, the ultimate acts of justice which bring destruction to the unjustly powerful. This will, however, renew the cycle of violence and the need for retributive justice from the side of the Persians. Thus the cycle is renewed when the news of the Battle of Marathon reached Darius. Darius is enraged at the news of this defeat. We are told he was more than ever determined to make war on Greece. So the war continues. Acts of injustice occur. They are countered by acts of retributive justice ending in destruction, often in the form of a battle. And the cycle repeats ad infinitum until we reach the great battles that ended the Persian War and threw off from the besieged Greeks the Persian yoke. Though we descend into a cycle of injustice and justice, which is manifested through violence, the 8th and 9th books see the slow, then suddenly rapid dissolution and retreat of the Persians from Europe. Herodotus gives great weight to human choice and action, despite accusations of a theologized history from modern partisans of the Whig disposition. Again, this seems to me to be the product of blind Whig historians who see too much invoking of gods. But even where the gods are invoked, they are invoked for purely human reasons: the desire for justice, the desire for justification, the desire for sanction and remission of guilt for the crime of usurpation or patricide. Moreover, human action in Herodotus is the result of human encounters. Whether the femme fatale, the treacherous murder, or the marauding invading army, human action is undertaken not from face-to-face encounters with the divine, but with mortal humans plagued by all the imperfections of human nature. Herodotus is, on this account, a very modern writer. Can Herodotus be salvaged from the modernist disposition? If we take the minimalist approach to historicism, he most certainly can. The organic and natural succession of events that constitute history from the modern mentality can be synthesized with Herodotus' account of human action governed by a dialectic of injustice and justice. As the histories open, an act of human injustice is counteracted by an act of retribution, what the Greeks would have considered justice. This starts the entire cycle of movement that takes us from the seas and walls of Tyre, Troy, and Lydia to Miletus, Athens, and Sparta. The manifold personalities we meet are also all too human in their desire and psychological problems. Augustine may have been the first systematic psychologist of the soul, but Herodotus anticipates the direction that Augustine will take by some 800 years in relaying very similar psychological and willful interpretations of the problems plaguing human beings. Herodotus ought to have been required reading for the readers, policy wonks, and experts in the euphoria of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union came tumbling down and the United States, leading the so-called free world, embarked on imperial overreach and aggrandizement not that dissimilar from the Persians in Herodotus' history. Part of the fall of Persia is from their extensive size and power. Persia is, by every account, far more powerful than the tiny city-states of Greece who decided to stand up to her. The fall of Persia was preceded by a spirit of overweening power and pride that convinced her that she should and could rule the world. Justice, then, is not only about retribution, but also the hand that produces equipoise in an unbalanced world. The inquiry of Herodotus into the inner working of human action is what is most important for us today. The Whig view of history likes to claim we have made progressive strides away from our darker ghosts and base desires. Herodotus shows us that human action is governed by the desire for justice, especially after suffering an act of injustice, however just the justification may be. The whole movement of human action, as Herodotus' inquiry reveals, is the movement of justice confronting injustice. Yet we also see in Herodotus how this desire for justice has a retributive and indeed destructive side to it. We might remain unsure which side will win, but the great and marvelous deeds which Herodotus sings of are the great and marvelous deeds of justice in a world filled with injustices. We are still the children of Herodotus after all.